The book of Laozi can almost, as Confucius said about the Shijing, be summed up in one phrase. Emulating the root by way of bringing to rest the stem and branches growing from it. That is all. In observing on what the 10,000 kinds of entities are based, and in investigating whereto they return, Laozi's words do not depart from the principle, and his activities do not lose sight of the ruler, as Laozi says about himself. Although the Laozi text has 5,000 characters, what threads through them is the one, as is the case for the Tao of Confucius. Although its ideas are broad and far-flung, in their multitude they are of the same kind. Once it is understood that it can be summed up in one phrase, there is nothing recondite that is not discerned. But when each theme is interpreted as having a separate meaning, then, analytic skill notwithstanding, the delusions will only increase. So right off the bat there with number one, I'll stop for number one there, but right off the bat, it's got that very specific theme of trying to summarize the whole of the text. You'll see in there he mentions, at least in square brackets, Confucius a number of times. That's because the translator obviously believes that Wang Bi is mirroring or quoting Confucius. Hold on. And so he provides a few translations here. You'll see at the beginning of one here, it says, the book of Laozi can almost be summed up in one phrase. And the translator drops the name Confucius there in square brackets and puts be summed up in one phrase in quotation marks. That's because there's a section in the Analects where Confucius says that the book of songs, or what they have here is the Shijing, can be summed up in one phrase. Do not think anything decadent. So right there at number one, Wang Bi is saying Laozi can almost be summed up in one phrase. And then he gives the phrase as emulating the root by way of bringing to rest the stems and branches. And the translator is saying, look, that's essentially what Confucius says about the Shijing. Confucius says a book of songs or the classic of poetry can be summed up in one phrase. Do not think anything decadent. So it's interesting there, Wang Bi is treating the DaoDeJing or the Laozi kind of like Confucius is summing up the Shijing in one quick phrase. There's also another section in here later. It says, here we go. Although the Laozi text has 5,000 characters, what threads through them is the one, as is the case for the Tao of Confucius. Obviously, that bit about Confucius is added by the translator, but you can go to another section of the Analects, and I want to say, yeah, here we go. Confucius says, what threads through my way is one, or the one. So just like Wang Bi, when he's discussing the DaoDeJing, is saying, you know, there's this root or this mother or source or this Tao that threads through everything or is, you know, somehow sustaining or the source of or sustaining all things. There's this one principle through it all. Confucius as well in the Luanyu or the Analects is saying, you know, what threads through my way is one. There's one thing through it, or the one, if we want to translate it that way. So again, here in that first section of this chapter, yes, he's summarizing the Laozi and saying there's one principle that runs through it, and it amounts to emulating the root by way of bringing to rest the stem and branches. But in the style and the phrasing, it's clearly hearkening to Confucius or the Analects there. So that's an interesting thing. I'm glad the translator pointed that out. I don't know if I really need to say more about what that summary statement about emulating the root means, but you know, I guess if I had to give a very quick summary or understanding that idea, and they're going to delve into it throughout the chapter, so that's why I'm saying it's not so necessary, but it's almost like when you bring these things to rest, you don't want them all struggling and fighting against each other, right? You want to make the conditions where they all can do what they're supposed to do and stay in their lane and not have conflicts and not have strife and not, be frustrated or fail. Just when you understand the root, or you can bring about the conditions whereby everything is in harmony and all the aspects that are possible can come to fruition naturally without having to tire yourself out. That's kind of the ideal grasp or understanding of the Tao, I suppose. It's kind of like, how do you make a plant grow? Do you place it in a location where it can have access to the sun and the water and create the conditions so that it naturally grows itself? Or do you stand there with a sun lamp and a watering can every day and exhaust yourself trying to get it to grow in this unnatural kind of environment? And then, maybe in that unnatural environment, there are other plants struggling for that little bit of sun and water as well. So, that's kind of my reading of how he's summarizing the whole text. But like I said, the whole chapter is going to go into it more. If anyone does have any comments to make or anything like that, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to continue at a decent clip to get through it, because again, it's about 9 pages, but I can stop if anyone requests a mic or has any comments. All right, let's dive into number 2. Here we go. I'm going to read from 2, and I'm going to stop at 13. I'm also getting a commentary on a TV show for my son. There we go. All right, 2. I will venture to analyze this. The rise of depravity. How could it be the work of the depraved? The development of debauchery. How could it be operated by the debauched? It cannot. That is why, as Confucius says, warding off depravity lies in holding on to sincerity as a ruler, not in the improvement of surveillance. Bringing debauchery to rest lies in keeping oneself as a ruler aloof from embellishments and not in displaying the more beautiful objects. Stopping robbery lies in keeping aloof of desires, oneself as the ruler, not in making punishments harsher. Stopping litigation lies in not honoring worthies oneself, not in listening better to the charges. That is why a sage ruler does not attack the people's desires, but brings it about that they do not have any inclination towards desires, does not thwart their actions, but brings it about that they have no inclination to act. According to the LaoZi, to take precautions as long as there are still no signs of danger to his life, and to act on dangers while they have not yet begun, that is all. I think a lot of what we saw just there is material that we've gone over in previous chapters already, and also in some of the fragments that that I brought up in other spaces. Because, for example, here, let's look at let's see what we got here. It's got warding off depravity lies in holding on to sincerity as a ruler, not in the improvement of surveillance. That's number 6. And then, of course, in this grammatical style, we'll read number 8 next, and it says, stopping robbery lies in keeping aloof of desires, not in making punishments harsher. And so I mentioned other fragments we read in other chapters. Remember the legalist idea of creating a surveillance state or a self-policing state where people would tell on each other if they broke the rule. That's like a surveillance state, right? And then what was the theory behind that? It was, well, if you can ensure that everyone gets caught when they step out of line, because you have this citizens or family members telling on each other, then you make the punishments extremely harsh. No one will commit robberies or any other crime, right? Because being caught will be guaranteed, and the punishments will be so severe that they won't bother. And so this section 6 and 8 seems to be kind of a direct response to that, right? Because instead of adopting that position, which he's criticizing, he's saying instead you should, for example, keep above desires. So it's sort of like defeating the idea of people wanting to commit robbery, because they will not commit robbery if there's no initial desire or greed for the gain. It's like, why bother if you don't actually have that desire or that will to obtain something via the robbery, which, you know, we can debate whether or not that is a more sensible way of getting rid of the desire to rob, rather than making the punishment so severe and so certain that you wouldn't bother risking it. But you can see it's part of that general debate or discussion. So I thought that was an interesting thing there. I think he's clearly responding to a legalist position. The just generally though, it's I think it's just adding more information to how to interpret that phrase, emulating the root by bringing to rest the stem and the branches. It's trying to just say, you know, be a good example. Don't agitate people. Don't imbue them with some sort of desire or you know, spirit of contest. And don't display beautiful objects so that they try and get them. You know, don't rile them up, and they'll come to rest, and things will work well. And don't you know, don't try to surveil them, like we see in number 6. And like we see in the legalist text, because then, you know, they're going to know they're being watched. And as we're going to hear later in the text, they're going to try and figure out ways to avoid your surveillance. And also the government will never really be a second nature, because people will always know that they're being watched, and they'll always try to be playing their tricks, and it's just going to be like a game where a dog chases his own tail. So that's what's that? That's, here we go. That was 2 to 13. So let's move down. We can do 14 to 22, unless anyone has any comments or any questions or things they'd like to say. Feel free to request the mic if you do. I'll just pause for a second. All right, let's get moving to 14 to 22. Oh yeah, just before I do though, just in terms of 2 to 13, you know, when the space started, I was mentioning with Matt about how this chapter reminded me kind of like an agriculturalist ideal, like Shen Nong and his utopian vision of like the men work in the fields and are simple and plain, and the women, you know, do the weaving and are otherwise simple and plain, and they just do their tasks, and they don't have any great desires, and they don't compete, and they don't have any warfare or anything like that. And here as well, it's just like, you know, don't show beautiful objects, don't try and surveil them, don't try and punish them, don't try to honor them and give them big titles, just keep them simple and plain and let them do their thing. And it's almost like that kind of agriculturalist utopia mixed in with a bit of Confucianism. Because again, obviously it's just like we saw in section 1, it's quoting Confucius here, mirroring the language from the Analects. And also it's talking about the ruler being an example. Because the ruler is not displaying beautiful objects. The ruler is being sincere, and not having like a bad habits like we see in 6. Warding off depravity lies in holding on to sincerity as a ruler. It's like if the ruler doesn't adopt these things, then the people won't be inspired to adopt them. So that is, I can see in the sense in which it is sort of an agriculturalist utopia, and I can also see very clear sort of the Confucian ideal of the ruler giving a good example to the people and being virtuous, and then because he is such, the people will in turn follow him or be more like him. But let's go to the next section so we get through this. It's 14 to 22. All right, here we go. Oh yeah, another interesting thing is you see 2 to 13, the author has said, enclosed essay on the rise of depravity and debauchery and the ways against them. And then at the end of 13, it says, end of enclosed essay. Obviously, the text itself doesn't say that. It's just interesting. And I'm not entirely sure why Professor Wagner identified that as a self-contained essay there. Maybe there's something in the textual transmission that suggests it should be. I can see that it's clearly dealing with its own little self-contained subject there about debauchery and depravity, but it's just interesting that he felt that that should be indicated as its own essay. Maybe there's something in the text itself in the intro notes. Let's see here, 14, finally, let's do it. Therefore, to exert wisdom and intelligence in order to regulate tricks and pretensions does not compare to manifesting simplicity and plainness in order to calm down people's desires. To promote benevolence and justice in order to destroy the shallow and vulgar does not compare to embracing the unadorned in order to complete the sound and the real. To multiply skill and profit interests in order to raise the utility of affairs does not compare to diminishing of egotism and desires in oneself in order to bring the competition for adornments to rest. Therefore, cutting off of surveillance and the submerging of one's intelligence, elimination of encouragement and promotion and the cutting off of adornments and eulogies, and the dismissal of skills and utility, as well as the despising of precious goods, all have only the purpose of preventing the people's craving for fame and desires for goods from being born, but they do not emphasize attacks on their being depraved. Therefore, manifesting simplicity and being unadorned for the benefit of cutting off wisdom and intelligence, reducing egotism and desires for the benefit of discarding skill and profit interests, these are all but styles for emulating the root by way of bringing to rest the stem and branches. There at the end there you have that same quote, emulating the root by way of bringing to rest the stem and branches, that we saw in number 1, which again was the sort of the one-line summary of the LaoZi. And we could go through 15, 16, 17, but if we just look at 22, it gives a very clear summary of what he's talking about here. It's like this two-angled approach. One is what you're actually doing, and then one is what you're not doing, and by extension, a criticisms of those who do it. So let's see what the first one is. What are you not doing? You're preventing the people's craving for fame and desires for good from being born. So you don't want them to desire a big name or a title or something like that. And you don't want them to have desire for luxury products like, I don't know, expensive wine. And I don't think they have sports cars, but racehorses and things, I suppose. At least in Greece, that would be one of the expensive products people desire. I suppose in China, they have chariots, right? But so on the one hand, the ruler is behaving in such a way that he prevents people from ever adopting that desire, which is ultimately going to lead them to compete with each other, cause a lot of disruption and problems. And then on the other hand, they do not emphasize attacks on their being depraved. So when we read that section earlier in this text, which seemed to be a direct response to the legalists, remember they said, look, you're not trying to build a surveillance state and then punish everyone severely. That's not really the way to go about things. But that is obviously the legalist advice on how you ought to do it. And here it's saying they do not emphasize attacks on their being depraved. So the goal is not to track down the people who have developed these depraved interests or desire for a big name or goods or the like. It's not to exhaust yourself trying to cut those people down or investigate them and figure out who might be going that direction. That's just the wrong way of doing things. The goal is to create the environment where everyone is simple and plain, and it just doesn't make sense to go down that road. And therefore you don't need to exhaust yourself with investigations, and you don't need to make the people suffer with punishments, and they won't compete with each other. So I took that to be the two angles he's getting at here. It's like, hey guys, ensure people are plain and simple by not giving them all these motivations, and don't engage in this whole surveillance state and trying to punish people and root out the wicked, because it's not about rooting out the wicked or punishing the people who break the law. It's just bringing around a situation where that whole kind of like a dog chasing its tail each generation, trying to catch the bad guys. It's just, you don't want to ever be in that situation. That's the whole point of this Taoist political advice. Whether it's practical or not, I don't know. But the let's see here. Yeah, I mean, I don't have to go through, I guess, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. I think it's summarized in 22. And I think if you give each one of those lines a little thought, you might see who he's responding to in terms of other thinkers. Obviously, I've been highlighting the response to the legalists because that seems to be one of the big responses. But there's also a response here to Confucians, right? Because it's whenever you see the text talking about the vulgar and base, like bad people, and punishing them, not just punishing them for a violation of a law code, but punishing them because they're morally bad or they're vulgar or they have these, profit motivations. That's not really legalist. Legalist is not really trying to make moral judgments of people and then identify who is morally bad or vulgar or has profit motivations. That's not really the point. The point is, here's a legal code. You should all be surveilling yourself. And when we're told that someone's been breaking the law, we're going to go and punish them. There's not really a judgment of anyone's character. It's just, you broke the law and here is this punishment. But for the Confucians, they are, in some sense, saying that certain people are bad or certain behavior is morally wrong and should be rooted out. Maybe it goes against the family hierarchy and they're a bad son or something. But here it's like, so it's not just criticizing legalists, but it's also kind of criticizing the Confucians to some extent. I don't think as much, but I think it is. Like, it's 16. To promote benevolence and justice in order to destroy the shallow and vulgar does not compare to embracing the unadorned in order to complete the sound and real. So it's like, don't make it into this dichotomy of like benevolence and justice, trying to root out those people who are shallow and vulgar. It's like, don't go down that track. Just like the legalists shouldn't go down the track of building a giant surveillance state with absolute punishments. But anyway, I'm going to go to 23 to 36. I'll pause for a moment if anyone wants to speak. Otherwise, I'll just dive right in. All right, let's do 23. It is a fact that if the Tao of the plain and unadorned does not shine forth, while the amenities of predilections and desires are not hidden, the ruler might go to extremes with his wisdom and enlightenment in the attempt to keep the people under surveillance, exhaust his intelligence and wit in an attempt to attack the people. But the more refined his skills are, the more variegated the people's pretensions will become. The more intensely his attacks on them proceed, the more efforts they will make to evade him. And then, indeed, the dull-witted and the intelligent will get the better of each other. The relatives in the 6 relationships will distrust each other. The unadorned disperses, and they become separated from their true nature, and there is debauchery in all affairs. Once the root is abandoned and its outgrowth is attacked, the wisdom and intelligence might be applied to the maximum. There will only be more such disasters, or there will only be more sure disasters. And how much greater will they be when a ruler's art is inferior to this maximum wisdom and intelligence? If, on the other hand, one, as does the sage according to Laozi, quiet them down by means of one's own plainness and being unadorned, then they would be, without one's interfering with them, rectify themselves. If, however, one attacks them with wisdom and knowledge, the people will become exhausted and the tricks will proliferate. Therefore, one might as well embrace plainness and being unadorned and discard wisdom and intelligence. It is generally true that, when surveillance by the ruler is simple, the people's evasion of it will be simple as well. When the ruler exerts his intelligence, then the people's eluding him will become more perspicacious. Their evasion being simple, damage to people's unadorned nature will be small. Their evasion being perspicacious, tricks and pretensions will become deeper. But who masters the art of supreme surveillance and of ferreting out the hidden, if not a ruler who has wisdom and intelligence? How, consequently, could the damage be fully measured that he inflicts? That is why the LaoZi statement about hundredfold gain, if wisdom and intelligence are discarded, is certainly not exaggerated. Okay, that was a lot of text to read there, but I think it can be summarized very easily here. Which is kind of why I wanted to get through the whole thing, because I think it's talking about the same thing. If we go here, let's see. Well, first he quotes LaoZi for the hundredfold gain comment, saying, if wisdom and intelligence are discarded, you're going to get a hundredfold gain. Here's the actual section of the DaoDeJing. It says, if the ruler were to discard wisdom and to reject intelligence, the benefit for the people would be 100-fold. All right, and then what's the interpretation Wang Bi is kind of putting forward here in this section? I think it's pretty obvious, but if you start surveilling people, and again, he's been criticizing these legalist surveillance state tactics the whole time, but if you surveil people, they're going to know that they live in that sort of system, and they're going to try and get around you. And then when they're trying to get around you, you're going to have to try harder. And then when you try harder with all your wisdom and your intelligence, they're going to try harder, and they're going to come up with new ways to avoid you. And it's like a dog just chasing his tail round and round and round and round. And you're never going to get into a situation where the government feels like it's second nature. There's never going to be any real feeling of trust between the ruler and the people. It's always going to be unnatural and exhausting, and there's going to be so many tricks. And instead of kept the people plain and simple, like if you didn't surveil them, would they have become so crafty to get around all your regulations? No, they'd be simpler. They would never have gone down that road of developing all that unnatural desire to evade regulations and pretend their guns got lost in the bottom of a lake or something. It would never have to be done. They wouldn't go down that track, and then you wouldn't have massive government bureaucracies trying to catch them out and to figure out all their new tricks. So if the ruler discards the wisdom and rejects intelligence and doesn't try to surveil them and get into all of this mess with the people, then the theory here, at least in this text, is that things are just going to be better off and the people will benefit 100-fold. And again, I think at the root here, or fundamentally one of the assumptions here, is this desire for an agricultural utopia of Shen Nong or someone where, the men work the fields and are plain and simple. The women weave at home, and they don't really compete for anything because there's no luxury goods or anything to compete for. Warfare isn't really known. There's no real point in raising armies and the like. It's not really a thing that people do at that utopian time, and government is just second nature. They don't have to surveil each other or believe that there's some sort of government over them taking tax from them and the like. And Shen Nong himself is, of course, not really known for engaging in huge amounts of luxury or anything. I mean, he himself is basically, kind of almost looks like a farmhand. I guess he has a big coat with leaves on it, and he tested herbs so people would be able to use medicine, but he's not really known for wanting gold or land or anything like that. So the whole thing here, even though it's not explicitly stated, and maybe I'm wrong in reading this into it, but I just see it as a very strong desire for a agricultural utopia with a Confucian Taoist ruler who is both virtuous in a sense, but really more almost stoic in terms of his self-control and not desiring anything, and therefore the people follow him. What's that, Sophia? My daughter just drew a dinosaur. Yeah. Good too. All right, there we go. I think that's all I would really say about 23 to 36. I think the unspoken assumption, though, is that desire for simple and plain people that they have to be doing something right. And it's just not luxury products or anything like that. It's all about just agriculture and women weaving and not having anything else on their plate. And they just never they never go down that track of having to trick the government to get out of regulations. And they're not striving after titles and the like. All right, I'll pause. If anyone wants to say anything, feel free to request the mic. Otherwise, I'm going to read 37 to, let's see, I'll go 37 to 46. Yeah, let's do 37 to 46. All right, let's do it. Here we go. It is a fact that if someone is unable to differentiate between different names, it is impossible to talk with him about principles. And if someone is unable to define names, it is impossible to discuss reality with him. Generally spoken, names are born out of forms, and it does not occur that forms are born out of names. That is why, if there is this specific name, there must be this specific form. And if there is this specific form, there must be this specific lot. As benevolence can by no means be styled wisdom, as intelligence can by no means be styled benevolence, each one of them has its own reality. It is a fact that he who searches out the most subtle is at the epitome of enlightenment. He who investigates and goes after the hidden and crouching is at the epitome of heedfulness. What if not wisdom is able to completely attain the epitome of enlightenment? What if not intelligence is able to completely attain the epitome of heedfulness? Thus, only by checking reality and defining the names and the intention to find out about the LaoZi's statement concerning the discarding of wisdom is it possible to be without error. Yeah, I don't want to say I'm not a fan of the style. Almost changed a lot. If the topic is still there, right? It's still about discarding wisdom and intelligence or benevolence. And by adopting not wisdom and not intelligence, you really achieve the height of intelligence and wisdom. And that section in 37 where it's, names are born out of forms, does not occur that forms are born out of names. If we go back, I'm not going to take the time, but if we went back to the 5th chapter, I believe it was the 5th chapter, we had a discussion of that, right? How, the names describing a teapot are coming from the teapot, so to speak. So I'd have to compare these two sections, 37 and what we read at the top of chapter 5 and the discussion that we had there. But I feel like there's a bit of not a reciting what was already said. I mean, it's different words, but maybe a bit of a revisiting of that topic almost. But what really jumps out at me here that I think we can, again, compare to what we see in older texts from, say, legalists, and I think it's a direct response, is this idea that, okay, look, we saw the comment from Laozi, we read it once already, the bit where it said, if the ruler were to discard wisdom and to reject intelligence, people would benefit 100-fold. Okay, we got a request. Hold on. Who's requesting? Oh, Alejandro. Did you have anything to say, Alejandro?
Sorry, this is selfish, but I've been listening, but not able to look at the text until now. I did want to say something, but I'd like to look at the text first. What page are we on, please?
Yeah, we're on. It should be page. Well, I don't think I have the page number on this screenshots, but we're at it's 37 to 46.
Okay, thanks. I'll have a look and keep listening. I'll let you know when I'm ready.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, okay, this bit about not wisdom and not intelligence, yeah, it could be another reference to that section of the Laozi 19.1 is where it's at. If the ruler were to discard wisdom and to reject intelligence, the benefit for the people would be 100-fold. But in one of these prior chapters, I introduced a section from the Book of Lord Shang, and a legalist text, and again, one that seeks to create a surveillance state and then have punishments. And actually, what that text says, like an actual quote from that text in, well, I'm just going to say in English, but the, by means of huge amounts of punishment, you achieve a state of not having punishment. Because again, the idea being you create this surveillance state where people are definitely going to get caught for the crimes they commit. And then you make the punishments extremely heavy, so no one's going to bother because they're going to think, I'll just get caught if I break the law. And then I'm going to get killed. And nothing's worth getting killed over, so I'm just not going to break the law. And so in the kind of, I almost want to say, not evil, but sort of a mock morality, it says, the rule that would impose that totalitarian surveillance state and absolute punishment is really the most benevolent and a wise ruler who loves the people the most, because he brings around a situation where nobody gets punished. Because again, perfect surveillance state plus absolute punishment means, in their theory, no one would commit crime, and therefore there's no need for punishment. And therefore it says, by means of the absolute most harsh punishments, we bring around a situation of having no punishment. And here in Wang Bi's text, we have, of course, by not adopting wisdom and intelligence to surveil or regulate or fight with the people, we bring about a situation that is the most benevolent and the most intelligent. And so I kind of see, I mean, it's not like he quotes Shang Yang or anything here, but I mean, I feel like this is similar sort of thinking, at least. And again, Wang Bi is in, I think it was chapter 2, where he went and started to criticize the various schools of thought. Legalism was one of those schools of thought. So it feels like he's adopting some very similar language that, yes, resembles LaoZi, but it's also just a general debate at this time period and in the earlier texts. So, that stood out to me there. I think much of it is this whole chapter, as you can see, we're obviously at 46 right now, but the whole thing is very, very, very political in terms of how a ruler ought to behave and what we should be inculcating in the populace. So I feel like much of this text is also easier to follow, and I probably shouldn't speak too much because, we all think about politics, and I think it's pretty easy to see what the author is proposing in a lot of these, as long as you understand the assumption that a simple and plain people living a very unadorned lifestyle is the goal, with no competition between them and no fighting and things like that. I'll take a pause though, if Alejandro, if you have anything to say. Or hey, Spalaton just joined, so how are you today, Spalaton? I'll pause for a moment. If anyone has anything to say, great. Otherwise, I will move on to, let's do 47 to 58. I don't know if I'll have much to say about these actually. 47 to 58. Let's do that. But I'll pause, and if anyone wants to talk, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll jump into it. All right, let's get it done. 47. It is a fact that if the capacity of the genuine and simple does not shine forth while the amenities of the fame and deeds are praised and exalted, then people will strive for that which is being exalted, and they hope for fame. People will strive for that which is being praised, and they will long for the profit. If hoping for fame and longing for profit motivates their activity, then the more beautiful the name becomes, the more alienated will one be from sincerity. The weightier the profits become, the more competitive the mind will be. I think that's very easy to follow there, and I think it's the same sort of ideas we've been encountering. It's like, look, fame and deeds are praised and exalted. Then people will strive for that which is being exalted, and they hope for the fame. People will strive for that which is being praised, and they will long for the profit. So there you go. If the ruler is upholding fame and deeds and praising and exalting them, then that's what the people are going to become. They're going to want to to do great deeds and become famous, because that's what's praised and exalted, and the ruler is just going to inculcate that in them. And then, of course, when you're seeking fame and deeds, what happens? The weightier the profits become, the more competitive the mind will be. So you're stepping further away from that plain and simple agricultural people, and you're now making these go-getters and strivers who are going to compete and fall in with each other, and there's going to be conflict and strife. Alejandro, please feel free to talk.
Okay, let me try this out. I've been listening. I was on a walk earlier, so maybe not following quite as closely as I'd like, but I still think I can formulate a question. And part of it might just also have to do with the fact that I have some rudimentary familiarity with the Lao-Tzu, the kind of what you could call primitive Taoism, but the legalist inflections you're pointing out here are a little bit lost on me because I'm not as familiar with that. But all that said, I'm sort of picking out two different tendencies here, and I guess I want you to sort of weigh in on whether one or the other or both are at work. So the one tendency that I associate more with what I was calling the primitive Taoism, the oldest stratum, so far as I understand, corresponds to this idea that that sort of, which appears in various ways in the Lao Tzu, that if basically by the time you have to name virtue, virtue is lost, that the effort to reconstruct and talk about it suggests that there's already some kind of downfall, and so one should aspire to a kind of natural way of life where it is a kind of unstated given. And I see an echo of that here in all of this stuff about that setting up goals like wisdom or benevolence, or what you will, is perhaps a mistaken process in that it fixates people on the definition of them as opposed to the sort of silent, humble practice of them. So that's one of the sides I see. The other side, which maybe corresponds more to the political and perhaps to the legalist bit, although you will tell me that because that's just not something I know about, is more about a program for government where it is not, we're not merely talking about the life of the common man anymore, but we're talking about someone who's in a different position of establishing regulations or ways of life for them through law. And then there's this question about, right, if we set up, if we create, for example, an ideal around fame, it throws things out of whack for every common person to become preoccupied with that because they simply can't. There's just, not everyone gets to be famous. And so it throws that out of whack. There has to be some kind of either unstated or explicit social distinction. But yet those two things I laid out don't seem to me to be exactly the same. It seems like each of them comes from a rather different perspective. Okay, let me know how I'm doing so far and if this is relevant.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly in terms of constantly referencing the legalists, I picked them to reference just because they provide, one, I mean, the text is responding to them in a lot of ways, but the that bit about using a surveillance state and very extreme punishments, not only is this text sort of responding to that general ideology, I suppose, but also it's just very easy to find in the primary source material, and it's a very tight example that can be brought up a lot because I think it touches on a lot of the same points in this text just from the other side. So I think it's just a and also it's kind of Taoist in its thinking, because it's like, remember, we're emulating the root by means of bringing to rest the branches and the stems. And what do we mean by that? It means, we're organizing and ordering everything in a way that it's all in accordance with this underlying principle and it all flows naturally. And the surveillance state and punishment is also kind of organizing everything so it goes the way you want it. In terms of the point you made about benevolence and intelligence, I think just quickly, in the text where he's talking about benevolence and intelligence, I think what he's referring to is something that they don't want to inculcate in the people. It's like something they don't want from Wang Bi's perspective here, because it's what's causing it to come about is regulation and surveillance of the people, and then the people try to get around that. And so he doesn't want that situation where the government has to have an active role in competing against people. But you got your hand up, Lisa. Maybe I misheard you.
No, I don't think you misheard, but this maybe just gets me to state my question in a slightly different way. So how do we parse that bit about not wanting to inculcate what were intelligence and benevolence, right, were the two words? One way would be that it is a criticism of the political means by which that is done. Another way would be, and so partly the question, I guess the question is in both cases, what, supposing this succeeds, right, supposing one follows this advice, what is the condition of the people? My, as I said, maybe unreconstructed, naive understanding of the original Taoist position is that if you leave them alone, they'll do what's right. They will have intelligence and benevolence as is appropriate to their station, right, without having it forced on them. And forcing it on them creates this kind of second order problem where you perceived as something to be fixed or modified, something that in fact was not a problem to begin with. And by continually putting more and more effort into trying to fix it, you actually create the problem and make it worse, right? So the root problem is you're not properly identifying the, let's say, inchoate benevolence and intelligence of the average person. And instead you're trying to import some, let's say, more abstract, consistent, systematic, law-based, or what you will, sense of it. And finding them wanting, you keep doing it harder and harder until you end up at a surveillance schema. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think so. I mean, I agree with you that a big part of this is wanting the people's sort of nature to shine through and not making them into something they're not giving them, you know, if you keep tinkering with them or tampering with them or oppressing them or trying to make them do things that they're not doing naturally, on the one hand, you're exhausting yourself and impacting yourself negatively. And on the other hand, yeah, you're impacting them negatively as well, and you're going to give rise to all these problems. In terms of, I just didn't see that. I mean, that last part, maybe I need to repeat it, but you said something along the lines of they're trying to develop some sort of. Well, let's do this. First, he said as well, if you leave them alone, they'll have their nature and everything. And if you don't tinker with them, you know, their natural goodness or the natural way they're going to be will shine through. That itself still needs to be fleshed out in the sense of what do we think the people's innate nature is. So the Taoist still has to answer that, right? Because it's like, all right, if you don't tinker with the people, if you don't wave expensive luxury products in front of their face, or like if the ruler doesn't give them an example whereby people with you know, noble families or who commit great deeds are praised and exalted in the state, if you don't motivate them in these ways, then they'll just do what they should naturally do and they won't. So then, okay, so what is what they should naturally do? So the Taoist has to kind of answer that. And then what is the benefit of them being that way? Like, how do they interact with each other? And in this text, and for, you know, I'm hardly the Taoist sage, but my reading of it is essentially, if you do not corrupt them, I suppose, or impact them like that, they're essentially going to be very simple, plain, rustic people who will just, you know, stick to agriculture or just stick to something that they can achieve on their own without competing with other people. Because what's the other angle of the text? It's like, what's the benefit to it? Well, everyone can be in harmony. because they're all going to be properly organized in accordance with the root, and they're all going to be fulfilled, which means not, we saw earlier in the text in this chapter, like you don't want them striving after profit and fighting with each other. You don't want them litigating against each other. You don't want them competing. So on the one hand, I think, yes, you're absolutely right. There's this desire not to tinker or tamper with the people and make them into something they're not. And then, well, then what are they naturally? Well, they're simple and plain people who won't fight with each other. And the benefit is, therefore, they can live in harmony and society can roll forward naturally and everything will be second nature. The thing about wanting to give them a different sort of intelligence, I don't think I quite followed, or maybe I wasn't listening closely enough. I don't think the ruler is desiring to make them intelligent so much as they become intelligent as they develop their tricks and their ways of getting around the government because they're in conflict with the government, because the government is trying to do something to them. So I don't. Maybe there's a Chinese text somewhere that talks about making everyone a sage, or educating people universally. But I don't know about that so much. I think it's more the worry in this text, at least, is intelligence consists of tricks and getting around the government, and that will occur if you tinker with them, because naturally you're doing something unnatural to them, and now they're going to develop all these responses, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that answers my question. There's a bunch of other ways we could go, but I think some of my confusion was just not being sufficiently familiar with the material. I guess I will just to throw out a different kind of example of the sort of situation that's not a Chinese example, although maybe it was as well. I don't know, but certainly in the. Oh, could you mute Tutorphone? That's super loud. Thanks. Yeah. I was just saying. Well, think about this, right? So when at a certain point in the West, in Europe, there's a goal of universal public education and literacy, right? And one of the outcomes of everybody knowing how to read is that many more people are now subject to propaganda, because not only the most intelligent and discerning people learn how to read, but also the most dim-witted people. Basically, everyone who's capable of reading learns how to read. So there's a possibility for leading people astray that simply didn't exist before. And similarly, once there's mass literacy and everybody learns to write, there's almost immediately an explosion of very bad writing, because again, not only the most discerning and intelligent people are learning how to write, but everybody's learning how to write. Of course, there's good writing that comes out of that too, but if you were to just look at it in a kind of gross statistic way, there simply has to be a lot more bad writing as the result of that, and this is one of the things that writers used to write about in the 19th century, that newspapers are killing literature, and you can go on from there. So I guess I was sort of having that kind of thought in the back of my mind, that and I see from your remarks that maybe I was misunderstanding the bit about intelligence. But I think that the broader thought is more or less that these benevolent top-down campaigns to improve the life of the common person can actually complicate the life of the common person and the well-being of the nation. So that was the broader kind of thought in the back of my head.
Yeah, and I think the that idea of these. Let's say we had a program to increase literacy and have everyone take writing 101 classes. Yeah, that's and exposing them to propaganda and yeah, absolutely, that's something that this text would want to avoid. I mean, that's like you're saying, that's going to be a very non-Taoist situation to be in, where you're just kind of perverting their nature, and there's just this explosion of new troubles, and yeah. Yeah, no, it goes against the whole, what I think is the underlying assumption here, which is to keep the people simple and plain and not get them involved in those sorts of conflicts. So yeah, I would be very surprised if someone like Wang Bi said, teach all the farmers how to read and give them writing stencils and newspapers that they can share with each other. If anyone else has any comments or Alejandro has anything else, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, I'll do 59 to 63. And actually, we're getting near the end here. Okay, 59 to 63 is what I'll do. But I'll pause for a sec if anyone wants to speak. All right, let's go. That between father and son, elder and younger brother, the affection they harbor lacks straightforwardness, so that filial piety will not be displayed with sincerity and compassion will not be displayed with honesty, is provoked by the ruler's praising of names and deeds. When out of disgust for the vulgar and shallow, fame and deeds are brought to flourish, and benevolence and righteousness are being emulated, this will only bring more of those pretensions. And how much more will this be the case when the art applied is even inferior to these two, namely benevolence and righteousness? That is why the LaoZi 19.1 statement concerning the ruler's discarding of benevolence and rejecting the righteousness for the purpose of making the people return to filial piety and parental love is not exaggerated. It is a fact that, what is that? Yeah, I'll do the last 63. It is a fact that when the city walls rise, war chariots make their appearance. When profits go up, greed among those not benefiting deepens. But, adapting a statement by Confucius de Ji Kangzi, the ruler of Lu, if only the ruler would keep to desirelessness, there would be no stealing, even if a premium were set on it. If, on the other hand, the ruler acts out his egotism and desires, then craftiness and lust for profit among the people will become even more dismal. That is why there is nothing better than to discard craftiness and reject the lust for profit, and instead to reduce one's desires, with the result that there would be no robbers and thieves. All right, a lot of practical examples there, and again, a lot of referencing earlier parts of this chapter. Looked at if we reduce one's desires, there would be no robbers and thieves. The fear that when profits go up, greed deepens. When city walls rise, then people get in their chariots and notice they can do something about it and conquer things. It's almost kind of like I mentioned this underlying utopian idea of a simple rustic people living in harmony and not desiring anything great. And here we have a kind of a doomsday scenario, right? So where do we start in 59? What's this doomsday scenario? So we've got the utopia that he's not agitating for, but he's writing this text in favor of, which is going to be, simple, plain people whose nature isn't impacted by the government or the ruler in some unnatural way. And they just plow the fields, weave cloth, and get along together. And they're not in conflict, and they're not having these big desires for a profit or for notoriety or the like. Hold on, Tick, we got a request from my LaoZi WeiZhi. Do we have the real WeiZhi here? Hold on, Tick. WeiZhi, I don't even know if that's how you pronounce that surname. Would you like to speak?
Oh, I just walked in. What were you guys discussing in brief?
All right. We are going to... All right, there we go. We're going to kick him down from speaker. Let's see if I know how to use Twitter. No offense, LaoZi WeiZhi, but I'm trying to tear through this chapter. We're near the end, and I don't want to... listen to the recording, mate. You'll love it. It's great stuff. So what's the doomsday scenario here? We have the utopian scenario where it's plain and simple people. They live in harmony. They're not competing. They're not desiring things. There's no robbery because, what's the point of stealing stuff if you don't have desires for great wealth? And what's the point in going out there and striving for great deeds, like starting up a big company or becoming a rich merchant, if the big name and the fame and the deeds aren't praised and exalted, as the text reads, right? You're not engendering that desire in people, and so they're not going to pervert their nature, I suppose, and fall into conflict with one another about it. But here's a doomsday scenario where that stuff all comes true. So 59, we have what? We have father and son, elder and younger brother. They're not honest with each other and they don't show filial piety. It's like why you've brought in this strife, and so I guess the strife has even entered into the household. So brothers will compete for profit and a big name or something, I suppose. And let's see, it says this sort of a lack of honesty and filial piety is provoked by the ruler's praising of names and deeds. So yeah, I suppose these younger and elder brothers want a big name and to achieve great deeds, and now they fall into conflict. So doomsday scenario number one, the family is disrupted and falling into internal strife. And then what do we have here? 62. Out of disgust for the vulgar and shallow fame. Oh, wait, yeah. Out of disgust for the vulgar and shallow. It's kind of hard reading it in this little narrow column and seeing how they've broken the grammar down. I could check the Chinese, I guess, but it looks like out of disgust for the vulgar and shallow. Okay, so in this doomsday scenario, we have people who say, I'm disgusted by vulgar and shallow people. What happens due to this disgust? Fame and great deeds are brought to flourish, and benevolence and righteousness are being emulated. Okay, so they want to go out there and they want to be righteous and do great deeds, I suppose, chastising the vulgar and shallow or correcting them. And this will only bring more of those pretensions. So it makes them pretentious and want to do all this, I guess, competing and chastising stuff. So now you've got the family is in strife with brothers competing against each other and not being honest with their fathers. You have ministers and other people who will show disgust for the vulgar and shallow and go out to, I guess, try to chastise or catch them and being very pretentious about that. And then, you know, in all of this competition, we see in 63, you know, if we start building city walls, well, then that means there's going to be armies around as well. And remember, Shen Nong, when his day was over, when his agricultural utopia ended, how did it end? Well, it's because people were taught about weaponry and warfare by Wang Bi, the Yellow Emperor. So I'm not saying this in every single tradition of how his time ended. I'd have to go back and read through more, but that's one example of how it was said to have ended. And so I suppose, yeah, war chariots show up and walls go up, and that whole project of building defensive structures kind of presupposes a whole project of chariots and the like, and better just not to go down that track, I suppose. But in the doomsday scenario, people have gone down that track of acknowledging that cities can be attacked, so they build up their walls, and if there are walls, then, well, there's got to be armies to go attack them. Profits are going up, so you've got profit seeking. And where the profits are going up and the economy is developing. So we're stepping away from an agricultural wonderland or utopia to a more developed economy where people can seek profits, and there's probably traveling merchants trading things, maybe even just trading agricultural products depending on the season and location. But when the profits are there, people see it, right? And so 63, those not benefiting are the ones that notice this, and their greed will deepen. And so they're going to try to get in the game, right? Because if the economy's developed and merchants or some other people, tradesmen or artisans, are making a ton of money with luxury goods or whatever they're doing, it's going to disrupt the children of the farmers, right? They're going to want to get in on that. Why be poor if someone else is getting it? I'll probably end it there in terms of those examples. I think that's all of them. But but you can see I read that section as a kind of a doomsday dichotomy. It's like, well, if you had done the Taoist track, you'd have your plain, simple people in harmony, not competing, and it'd all be golden. But because you've allowed in these terrible things that can plague the populace, now you've got all these troubles, from filial piety breaking down to the farmers' children wanting to get into the trades because they see profit and they want a cut of that, and so they're all going to be in competition. And if we want to compare that to something in Greece, you know, Alejandro, you mentioned, for example, the impact of people being able to read and the proliferation of writing and texts and the like. You know, when I read this, I didn't read this today, but I was reading this the other day. I was thinking of that section in Thucydides where Corcyra has been undergoing some civil strife, and Thucydides writes a section about, how bad the Greek world is going at that time because of all this strife. And it's like sons will kill their fathers. Everyone is kind of competing, the Democrats and the oligarchic factions, just in this huge contest. And to that point about reading and writing, I've also heard that the average Athenian citizen, or all of the Athenian citizens, had a degree of literacy, and you do see an explosion of writing in the 5th century. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, I read 59 to 63 as a big doomsday scenario of like, this is the bad stuff that's going to happen if you don't listen to me and be a Taoist. And it also just kind of reminded me of that doomsday scenario that we see Thucydides living through and writing about in the Peloponnesian War. Right around that section. I didn't pull the sections. I didn't double check. It's just like off the top of my head, where he's complaining about the strife undergoing in Corcyra and how the entire Hellenic world has kind of descended into this terrible, terrible, bloody civil strife. Sacred, you requested the mic, so feel free. I have nothing else to say on this section. Let me see how I give you the mic. There you go. You ought to have the mic, mate. Feel free to talk.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank this space. I wasn't following so much today, but I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, when you were, I'm sure it's this room here and this subject here, is about like the Tao in terms of finding this middle way, which is beyond the middle way, is about no form, and it really hit me in terms of why one educates themselves with different knowledge bases, knowledge domains, and all of this discussing text like this is so very important. But at some point, you have to leave it and you go beyond form. That was my message. So I wanted to share that. And I got a video on that. My mentor told me that too in life. Like I started reading very, very late in life and in my 30s. And I was very fortunate to get a mentor who convinced me of my ignorance. And I started to read. And so I got a couple of books under my belt.
Well, I would.
So
Sorry, Carol. I would say.
yeah.
Well, okay. I was just going to say, I would suggest. You said you had just jumped in here, and if you're interested in the practice more than just the theory, I think this is a really good
practice.
chapter.
But I do the practice.
Yeah, I think this chapter is really right on point. Like, if people want to have the more practical political advice section of this text, because it's been 6 chapters, and so this chapter here, though, I think is not only is it the longest chapter in the text, but it's right on point for practical advice and the like. So I'd highly recommend it if you have a chance to go back and
but I'm studying constantly, so I'm retired. I'm very fortunate. All I wanted to say is that that's the space that you had 2 or 3 weeks ago. It just hit home, and through some synchronicities is like if I may share this, I'll share it 1 minute quick. It's like I dedicated myself last winter is now that I'm retired is to continue really going deep into my metaphysics, right? Which includes Hinduism, Buddhism, Western philosophy, whatever, right? And looking for the universal in it all. But the point being is you learn all of this stuff, right? So I use the metaphor, I'm going up the mountain. But as you go up from base camp to base camp, you end up having to leave some of those books and those knowledge. They're still there in your head, but you don't carry them. Am I trying to get them? Meaning, you find your language very sacred, but as you're finding more and more universal truth, you find that the contradiction, the dichotomy in the thoughts, and you're very, very connected to source, if you will, but it just goes. I think the way is trying to show it. It's always beyond form. That's all I'm trying to say. I don't know if I explained it very well, but that was something that verified and validated where I was and where I am right now. It's great to have these conversations, and I recommend people, taking up an intellectual practice or so forth. But in the end, I think what these texts are saying is it'll take you so far, but at some point you got to go beyond the form into the pure experience, if I will. So I can't
Well,
explain it any better than
I'm glad you.
so. But
No, I think that was great. I'm glad you've been enjoying the space a couple of weeks ago. Again, it was the same text as this one. It was me hosting it, so I'm glad you were there for that one. I think I remember seeing you in. I think I saw you in two of them actually. So I'm glad you got a lot out of it, and
I'm
hopefully we'll
glad there are
keep
people like
everyone.
you who are doing these types of texts, because this is what Marshall McLuhan thought an internet would be, is where people would actually come and learn different knowledge domains and have real discussions, intellectual,
Oh, the internet.
not all about
Yeah, the
puppy
internet's been
dogs and
amazing for us.
pornography.
Yeah, the internet's been
So
amazing for us.
you're doing a great service, brother. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to get through. We're almost at the end here. We're on the second last page of the stuff up in the jumbotron. I'm going to read 64 to 73 now, and I have a. Yeah, let's see what's on. Yeah, okay. Then I have a little bit to say about that, I guess, and then I'll do 74 to. What's the last section here? 77, and that'll be it. We'll have done 6 whole chapters of this text and gotten through it all. So let's do 64 to 73. It is a fact that wisdom and intelligence are the heroes among the talents. Benevolence and righteousness are the greatest among the forms of conduct. Trickery and lust for profit are the best in usefulness. If, when the ruler does not keep to the root, but lets these amenities flourish, the damage to the people is already such as described. How much worse will the damage be if the arts applied go even further than these which have been mentioned, in disregarding plainness and simplicity? That is why people of old sighed. Indeed, why are things so difficult to understand? Having already understood that non-wisdom is non-wisdom, one still fails to understand that wisdom itself is non-wisdom. Having already understood that non-benevolence is non-benevolence, one still fails to understand that benevolence itself is non-benevolence. That is why only once wisdom is cut off, the achievements of wisdom will be completed. Once benevolence is discarded, the capacity of benevolence will be ample. So I'll stop it there pretty quickly. I think 65 to 68 is pretty self-explanatory, which I think is something I've probably been saying this whole text for a lot of these sections. But we had that doomsday scenario, and 65 to 68 spells out some more things that people may desire or find useful and the like. And then he's saying, these will damage the people and impact their plainness and simplicity. And then he holds up the people of the old, right? The old or ancient people. And he said, when they looked forward, they sighed. Well, why is the world so difficult to understand? Why is it getting so complex? What's going on here? So he's kind of like hearkening back to a golden age of plainness and simplicity, which is that assumption I thought is always underlined this text of that agricultural ancient fantasy world. Where people are simple, plain, and get along, and they don't have all these complexities to them and contests. If we look at, let's see here, 72 and 73, I think in the last section we discussed how, by discarding intelligence and benevolence, we bring about those things, or by having extreme punishments and an extreme surveillance state, we get rid of the need for punishments because people won't bother to commit any crimes. And I said, those are similar thoughts. I think we see that again here in 72 and 73. It's like, once you cut off wisdom, the achievements of wisdom will be completed. Once benevolence is discarded, like this pretentious, it was described as earlier, pretentious to desire to go out there and, strike down the vulgar and base and clean everything out. Once you get rid of that, then there will be real benevolence, I suppose. Benevolence will be ample. But yeah, I think this is just speaking more to that doomsday scenario. I see we have a requested mic, so before I read the last section, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. Darkly, I'm just going to call you Darkly, and I'll add you a speaker. Feel free to speak up. Or feel free to drop out of the room the moment I give you the mic. Either way. I'll pause for a moment if anyone wants. Oh, you're back again. Hold on. Invite to speak. There you go. I added you right as you dropped out. So if you'd like to speak, feel free to accept the mic darkly and make a comment, observation, ask a question, whatever you'd like. All right, whatever. Let's let's read 74 through to the end of the text. And if someone throws their hand up and I'm looking at the screen, I'll chuck you the mic and you can talk. To despise strength does not mean that one does not. Oh wait. I'll start again. 74. To despise strength does not mean that one does desire not to be strong, but rather he who acts strong loses his strength. To discard benevolence does not mean that one desires to be non-benevolent, but rather in acting out benevolent pretensions, pretensions among its objects are brought about. By clinging to order, chaos indeed is brought about. By protecting one's security, peril indeed is brought about. In the LaoZi's statement that the sage puts his own person in the background and achieves it in this way, that his own person comes to be to the fore, that his person comes to be to the fore is not brought about by his putting his person to the fore. In the LaoZi's statement that about the sage, in the LaoZi's statement that the sage disregards his own person and achieves in this way that his own person will last. The lasting of his person is not achieved by making his person last. As achievements cannot be grabbed, and as amenities cannot be made use of, one must take hold of the mother that brings about the achievements, and that is all. The chapter of the LaoZi says, once, having understood the mother's offspring, i.e. all under heaven, the ruler has to, in turn, keep to the mother of all under heaven. Having come to an understanding of this principle, where could one arrive without being in the clear? And that is the end of the entire text of Wang Bi's, what is that, 老子微指略例. But I'll just quickly comment, I guess, in these last few sections. I gobbled the reading a bit there, but obviously it's much the same as what we saw in 72 and 73 there. 72 being once wisdom is cut off, achievements of wisdom will be completed. Once benevolence is discarded, capacity of benevolence will be ample. That same thinking runs through these sections here. I see in 74 here, like where it says, to despise strength does not mean that one does desire not to be strong. All right, I would never grammatically phrase it this way. I would just say, to despise strength doesn't mean you're trying to be weak. It's just that if you go around exerting your strength, you'll lose your strength. I don't mean in the sense that if you don't go to the gym, you're not going to become, by not going to the gym, you become strong. No, but I mean, you'll exhaust yourself, right? Much of this is about not exhausting yourself by having to run around and solve all the problems and not like what is strength here for a ruler? It's not like bodily strength in like exercise. It's more like an army or something. If you're just like throwing an army against another army, you're going to destroy your strength, right? If you act strong, you lose your strength because you're destroying it, I guess, in a sense of engaging in needless warfare. So I think that's really what's being said there. But Matt, you have your hand up. Please feel free to speak.
Yeah, thank you for that brilliant reading. One quick thing that I threw up also on the Jumbotron is this kind of mapping of the Bagua with respect to, some of these terms and concepts that you've mentioned already, such as like wisdom and intellect. And basically the negation of these things kind of contributes to, what Laozi is trying to say, which is, I think back in 37, you were kind of mentioning that Laozi was saying that in order to have communication at all, in order to have language, one has to name things, right? And so there is this type of subtext where a minimum amount of intellect has to be used. And when you look at this map, the opposite of the intellect is it kind of burns this type of intuition into others, because opposites kind of form in this type of yin yang reality sphere. And this is one of the reasons why pretensions can be very dangerous, because as soon as you kind of release your intellect, like in a government form, in a political way, where you're trying to design rules for a game, when you're trying to write laws that are like a lot of gotcha moments, right? Um, these things subvert kind of trust, public trust, and so it makes your intuition, your subconscious, speak a lot of volumes, and conspiracy theories pop up, right? That mistrust, yields this, two things becomes three, and three becomes 10,000. And similarly, because wisdom is kind of lies on the opposite spectrum of the axis of desire. If you want to avoid, the Girardian scapegoat of envy and desire, then you have to suppress the wisdom. So a lot of this really, really makes sense, because what you're really trying to achieve in this type of order is to be orthogonal to will and sensation, and because you don't want to disrupt, will and freedom and independence. You want those to be reigning with, creativity and listening, and and it's a really interesting concept, because in you kind of mentioned, like, legalism is about punishing very severely in order to set an example, so then you get no crime, right? And this is like a supreme form of the overuse of intellect, creating that surveillance state. And Confucianism is like the over expression of wisdom. You're basically creating a woke society, trying to shame everybody for vulgarness, but what you end up creating is empty virtue signaling, which creates this hierarchy of joy and envy. And this is what we're experiencing today. So Lao Tzu's third way is a very clever one, which is that the negation of it psychically does this reality distortion field that fixes things. So I think that this was a very magical chapter. So thank you for this.
No, yeah, I'm glad you're able to join us, and thank you for mentioning the Book of Changes there as well. Wang Bi as well has a commentary on that, and I think in was it chapter 3? One of these earlier chapters, there was some. He was drawing language from one of the wings to the. Oh, it's chapter 4, to one of the wings of the Book of Changes, the Xi Zi. So he's quoting it there. So Wang Bi is, he's definitely drawing on that material. I only mentioned Book of Changes, as you mentioned the Bagua. So the Wang Bi is definitely drawing some of that material, and I'm definitely glad you're able to be here as well for this chapter. I think I saw you in a couple of the other ones as well. The in reading this last section, I didn't have too many comments other than what I just said about the strength. It's just what I like. You could almost read chapter 6, like you're saying that you like this last chapter here. You could almost read chapter 6 as a standalone product. And what does it say at the end here? It's about having come to an understanding of this principle. Where could one arrive without being in the clear? It's like when you understand that all under heaven is coming from this universal principle, or this one, or this source or mother, when you understand that context or source or sustaining force, and how you can align everything with it and it'll all go well, where could you be without being in the clear? Because you understand basically the fundamental principles. And then what is the very beginning of this chapter? And I see you requested the mic there, Darkly. I will give it to you just after this. What was the very beginning of this chapter? So at the very end of the chapter, it's like, you know what? When you grasp the root, you're never going to be in trouble, because wherever you're at, you're going to know the fundamental rules of the game. And then right at the beginning, what is it? He's like, you could almost sum up the Laozi or the DaoDeJing in one phrase: emulate the root by way of bringing to rest the stem and the branches. So again, it's all just about that one thing that threads through it. And he also, in that first section of this chapter, quotes that part of the Analects where Confucius says, throughout my way, there is one thing, there's one thing that threads its way through my teachings. So I like that the very end of this chapter also harkens back to the very beginning of the chapter. I think that's a beautiful way to end chapter 6. And I would almost, and also the whole text, because again, that's the saying that he thinks could sum up the whole DaoDeJing, just like Confucius thought that there was one saying that could sum up the whole of the book of poems. But anyway, I'll just very quickly as well. 75, where I had trouble reading through that. At the end of the day, I think that's also a bit of a harkening back, because it's about like putting the ruler putting his person, disregarding his person, or putting his person in the background, and by doing so he succeeds. And we saw in chapter 1 and elsewhere that what did we read? We read that when good things are happening, if the ruler is governing well, they won't be pointing at the ruler and saying he's the cause of it, because the ruler almost just kind of is in the background and has ordered things so well that it all just kind of naturally flows. And then in 75, it's like, if you just position yourself right, you'll have a long life, and you'll do well. And it's not like you need to thrust yourself out there and have people see you. So I think that the end of chapter 6 really sums up a lot of what we see in the text. And I do like how chapter 6 could be, as you were pointing out, Matt, it's kind of self-contained political treatise. And it kind of just wraps it all up with a bow on it. But I've spoken too much. Darkly, you onto the mic, so feel free to chat. Hold on, let me give it to you. Hold on. There we go. You should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me? Nope.
Yeah, I can hear you, mate. I can hear you.
Hello?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I can.
Well,
I can. Feel free to
I've
talk.
never used Twitter before. I don't really use Twitter. I don't use any of these. So what I wanted to say previously, and it's related to this, is I think in a lot of philosophy, especially a lot of old philosophy, there's a lot of wisdom, and like we read it because we want to improve ourselves and want to be wise. We're trying to strive for something better, but in there we turn ourselves into something that we're not. And that you see that in what these things advocate for, keeping people simple, not confusing them. And this is like generally pretty universal thing within most wisdom text, is the advocating for simplicity and not basically let go of being wise, but in engaging in that and recognizing the importance of that, we end up in a contradiction, because that is not what we are doing as people reading these things and looking into these things. And I think there's a certain level where you have to acknowledge of who we are and what we're doing and embrace that, while not trying to be something we're not. And I think that's really the living up to that simplicity, is being where you are, even if that is striving for things that you are not, but fully embracing that. And I think that's the simplicity, because we can never go back to how things were. This is advice for people 1,000 years ago.
Well, yeah, I definitely appreciate what you just said there, and I, in reading these texts, I know there are points where I disagree with Wang Bi, and I don't see myself returning to an ancient world of simplicity and plainness. But even for Wang Bi, it's a bit of a challenge, right? Because remember that section we read? I closed the book now, but essentially, I think it was 60-something, and there was a part where he said, the people of antiquity said, why is the world so complicated now? Even for Wang Bi, he's saying, hey, looking back, this unadorned and plain and simple world of some utopian antiquity, it itself has also passed Wang Bi by, in a sense. And he's perhaps trying to go back to it, or trying to inspire us to be more like it. But even for him, the past has, he's kind of in a new world of his own too. And also, when we bring up all these legalist examples, what was one of their debates with the Confucians? The Confucians go around and they say, look, the sage kings did this. The three Huang, or the what is it, San Huang Wu Di, or whatever it is, they had all these ideas in the past, and if we imitate them, it'll all be good. And the legalists are arguing back and saying, no, you have to come up with plans that fit our age. You can't keep looking back to some golden age of antiquity and imitate them. Because if you imitate them, it won't work. The context is different now. But anyway, I definitely thank you for that comment. And yeah, in reading these texts, there's parts that I really appreciate about it, but also there's parts where, I just sometimes don't agree with things Wang Bi suggests, and I don't see myself getting to work in the field under a benevolent agricultural ruler in some utopian agriculturalist antiquity. Although maybe if I'd been born in that, I would have liked it. But maybe it's that ship has sailed.
I don't even necessarily would say I disagree. I think largely all of this stuff is correct. It's just that what is right and like correct and true, we don't live in that world and we don't interact in that space, and that is and that ends up being like what Confucius talks about, rectifying language, where we don't live in the correct world. We live in the human world, not the truthful one. And so if you try to operate in a way and advocate for things that work in the truthful world, in the true, in like where things are reflective of reality, you're gonna hit rocks. You're gonna pound sand, because the other humans, the other people you interact with, aren't gonna interact in that way. You will be trying to fulfill one social contract where everyone else is working in another one, even if you are truer to reality. And I do think it is, and like I do think this is correct. It's just humans aren't correct.
Yeah. I feel like they could almost be, this space we read through the chapter. I myself and a bunch of other people threw in some comments like we did on all the other chapters. But I almost feel like next to a read-along space, there's plenty of material just for spaces where people step aside from the text and try to just discuss the ideas and see how applicable they are and compare and contrast them with others. And there's a lot left to be discussed. It's kind of like you read through it. I've read this text multiple times, and we read through it this one time through Twitter. But yeah, the conversation is definitely never going to be over in just one of these spaces. But I'm gonna wrap it up there. I've actually I'm going to sit down to dinner in a bit with my family. I'm very glad you were all able to make it. This is all recorded. If you click on my profile, you see I also made a playlist on YouTube where I just uploaded the recordings. The audio is a bit, iffy. And the audio from today is probably going to be a bit iffy too. I've just been doing it on my phone. But time permitting, I'm going to upload this episode as well. And then on YouTube, what we'll have is there should be all 6 episodes in a playlist. Right now, all 5 of them are up there, and then this one will be next. And it's something like 8 hours of content on Wang Bi. And I really, I doubt anywhere else on YouTube or somewhere there's 8 hours of content of reading through this obscure Taoist text with a bunch of interested people on Twitter and then discussing it. So, thanks everyone here. Thanks to everyone who contributed, and have a good day. Bye.